Can you hear me? Ah, yes. Brilliant. Good evening, and it's great to see everybody this evening, as ever. And it's wonderful to have Bishop Sam with us this evening, and he's going to talk to us about his life, his ministry, his faith.
Great.
So welcome,
Thank
Bishop
you. It's very
Sam.
good to be with you. I must say, you all look nervous. I'm the one that's supposed to be looking nervous here. But there we are.
So, Bishop Sam, welcome to St Andrews.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
And can we just start off by talking a little bit about your home life when you were a child? Tell us a bit about your background, if you would.
So I grew up in a small village southwest of Cambridge. It's a village called Orwell. It's the kind of village where my family had been there for generations. So if you kicked one of us, we all screamed. So Nan was one of 5, I think, and they were all in the village, as were all of Mum's generation and most of my generation. And they're all still there as well. So I'm the black sheep of the family because I moved away, went to university. I was the first in the family to kind of stay on at school, do A-levels. And so most of the family had worked on the land or on farms. So the guys outside on the estates and the ladies often in... there was a big house, a big National Trust place, which used to be run by Rudyard Kipling's daughter. And so Nan had worked there as a kind of housekeeper and things. So Dad worked in a factory making chemicals, having looked after pigs, and Mum was a hairdresser and cleaner and things. So it was an idyllic childhood. Nan and Grandad were just down the road, so if the food was rubbish at home, I could jump on the bike, moan to Nan about how awful her daughter's cooking was, and the frying pan would come off the wall and there would go. So that's the reason why I'm the size I am. Also because Nan's sister, Auntie Olive, was the school cook. So it was desperate. There was food everywhere. And so...
And did you have brothers and sisters?
I did and do. I have a brother, Michael, who's 3 years younger than me. We never really got on. I was about 25 when I realised he was quite nice, actually. But we were very kind of different, look different. I take after Mum's side, he takes after Dad's side in how we look, and just different interests. I was always interested in church, helping out on the farm. Michael was always interested in films and his friendship group. So, very different.
And did Michael stay in the village as well?
No, he's moved out. So he went to university at Sheffield and is now in Ely, works for the Arts Council. And Mum and Dad have moved out of the village. Once Nan died, so they sold up and moved out of the village and joined Michael in Ely.
Very good. And what was school like then? Junior school, secondary school, was that nearby? Was it the village school?
Yeah. So the village, it was terrifying, to be honest, the village school. Yeah. It was run by some very scary people who I won't name because the world's so small, they might be relatives here.
They might be watching.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, they might be watching. So, what defined my early childhood really was a new vicar moved into the village when I was 4 years old. And he had a daughter the same age as me, Rebecca. If I'm being honest, I loved Rebecca. So I just wanted to do what her dad did as a way of getting near to Rebecca, I think. So from a very early age, I said I wanted to be ordained. In fact, one Sunday morning, my mum and dad used to lie in, as every parent has a right to do. And I was in that kind of stage where, as a parent, you long for the children to go to sleep, which is quickly followed by the other stage, which is you long for them to get up. But I was still in the kind of go to sleep and thought, well, there's nothing much going on at home. I'll go and see Rebecca. So after about an hour of being in church, a very fractious mum and dad walked into church. And so I beat Jesus by 8 years, but I didn't have the presence of mind to say to a somewhat irate father, "Did you not know? I am in my Father's house." So I can fill in some of the backstory of that episode in the Gospels. But after that, it was kind of, I was sent to the local Methodist Sunday school with my nan's best friend. It was the kind of village where they'd grown together, but they always referred to each other as Mrs. Clint and Mrs. Thompson. And I kind of wondered what it was like at school. Did they still call each other Mrs. Clint and Mrs. Anyway, but I was accompanied to the Methodist Sunday school, and from an early age was involved both at the Methodist chapel and in the local Anglican church, doing everything, reading, ringing bells, serving.
But Mum and Dad didn't go with you?
But Mum and Dad
No?
didn't go,
No?
no. So they still managed to sleep in on Sunday mornings.
And what about Michael? Did he go?
Michael did for a bit,
Yeah.
but didn't quite. He preferred to sleep in on Sunday mornings as well.
So you were the only one going, and you always wanted to go.
Yeah.
And why did you want to go? Do you remember? Was it
To be near Rebecca.
Just
to worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness.
what was the appeal when
the
you were...
appeal was a sense of community,
Yeah.
of people that were interested in me, and of people that gave me opportunities. It was Easter Day in 1983, and the gospel reading at the Methodist Chapel was that wonderful passage at the beginning of John 20, where Peter and John run to the tomb and discover it's empty and run away again, but Mary stays. And Mr. Wissom came up to me before the service and said, "I'm due to read today, but I'd like you to read." And that was one of those kind of moments that stuck with me. Here was someone who was about 158 saying, I want you to do this, to be involved in something. I probably read appallingly badly, but I've never forgotten that kind of moment of being asked to do something, of being involved in something at 7 years old. And both churches were really good at involving me, whether it was ringing bells or serving, giving me great opportunity. 2 years
So
after
is it
that,
a sense of belonging,
Yeah.
and a sense of
Yeah.
giving you things to do and responsibility?
Yeah, 2 years after that, the Sunday school prize was a book I was given which said "The Boy Who Knew Too Much," which I sure meant personally. But yeah, it was just a brilliant place of belonging and of encouragement, really, and of I felt like I was used and had a place and something to contribute. Yeah.
Did you feel at that point that you had a living faith?
I knew it was important.
Yeah.
And like many teenagers, wrestled to kind of make sense of it all. So I worked on a farm. I have to say I've never worked so hard in my life. People sometimes say, "Why did you become ordained?" It's like, well, having worked all the hours God sent, working 1 day a week seemed quite attractive. But kind of being immersed in the countryside, hands dirty with soil, quite literally, was hugely important. So I've always had a sense of God's presence, I think.
Yeah.
If you see me in my robes, the kind of cope and mitre, there's all kinds of swirls and things. And what that's trying to depict is how I've always had a sense of the Lord's hand on my right shoulder from a very, very early, almost a tangible sense at times of the Lord being present with me and just experiencing that as a presence on my right shoulder. But trying to make sense of that, to relate that to choices, to lifestyle, to what I think about God, how I understand him to be at work in the world, that took quite a bit longer.
Yeah. So there was no light bulb moment when you were a teenager or
No,
before
but-
you went to university?
Yeah, no, there wasn't before I went to university. But at university, where I struggled to belong, having grown up in a village where I knew everyone, suddenly I went to Durham, which is a bit like going to university on a roundabout, but it's a very beautiful roundabout with a cathedral. But I didn't really know anyone, and I found that quite disorientating, and struggled to find a place there. And got caught up in a kind of intellectual arrogance, I think, of thinking I was cleverer than anyone else. Back to the book, The Boy Who Knew Too Much. And kind of got into, well, God's just a subjective experience, which made kind of...
This was on your theology course?
Yeah, in theology, which made rational sense. But actually, it was always kind of like, this isn't speaking to my heart. And then my then girlfriend bought me a biography of Thomas Cranmer, who was Henry VIII's Archbishop. And I got really interested in that and decided to stay on at university to look into this guy's theology a bit more. And I did a dissertation in Thomas Cranmer's Doctrine of Salvation, and remember weeping through the final chapters of this biography as the story of how he was arrested under Mary I and then persecuted and eventually burnt at the stake for holding fast to his belief in the truth of Jesus Christ. And that got me. And reading his sermons gripped me. There's a sermon of his on salvation and about how it's only through Christ alone, nothing to do with us, everything to do with him. And it gripped me. And I once said to Rowan Williams, the previous Archbishop of Canterbury, when he asked me about how did I come to a living faith, I told him this story of being gripped by Thomas Cranmer's sermons. And he said, it's wonderfully encouraging as Archbishop to meet someone who takes seriously what we say. Even if it takes 400 years for people to realise. So, yeah. Yeah, so that was a kind of key moment of head and heart coming together. And I was driving back to my parents one night, and there was a hill near where we lived. I know it's Cambridgeshire, but there was one hill near where we lived. And I just had a sense of the Lord saying to me, it was kind of about 10:30 at night, again I say to you, Sam, your way or my way. And I said, this time, Lord, your way. And it was almost as if the whole horizon kind of lit up. And I had a really strong sense of God saying, and I call you to minister to my people. And yeah, it was like all of the bits of things fitting together.
And before that, it was more of an intellectual faith with a sense of God's hand on you. But you went to read theology. Why did you read theology? Why did you not read?
Because I wanted to be ordained, and I thought that was a good natural step. And also my RE teacher at school, who was hugely influential, Mrs. Lynch, had done theology at Durham.
Right.
And because my parents hadn't really gone to university, how do you know what to do, where to go? So Mrs. Lynch kind of guided me through. She's now ordained as well, so she was at my consecration. She wasn't overly chuffed when I said, this is Mrs. Lynch. She was my RE teacher. She's like, makes me feel about 98. Thank you very much. So that's why I went to it was a kind of, I was attracted by a place where there was a long kind of tradition of taking theology seriously with the cathedral links and all of that kind of stuff. And
And can you tell us a bit more about Mrs. Lynch? What was her? How did she impact on you?
I can tell you that in the Year 9 parents' evening, I confessed to how I said, Mrs. Lynch, you have such lovely eyes. Which she's never let me forget. So she was great. And
no, I didn't know that before.
Yeah,
tonight.
no.
That wasn't the answer I was looking for.
You're very good at this. You're very good at this. I think looking back, she was another person for whom there was it was real.
Yeah.
It wasn't just dry and academic. It was real and living. Yeah.
And were there other people in your childhood who have had a similar impact on you in terms of their influence? And
if my life's a dirty rag, and Jesus is the one who purifies and cleans, there are gold threads woven through Mrs. Lynch, Julian Thompson, the vicar when I was 4, and people all the way through since, really. There are 2 people, Mr. and Mrs. Miller, who own the farm where I worked. And on the day I got my A-level results, Mr. Miller, who was a JP, he was 72, he died 6 months after this, actually, and had been hugely influential in all kinds of things in the village and the region and things. He came out of the farmhouse because Mrs. Miller had just gone in and told him what I got in my A-levels. He came out of the farmhouse dancing. And I've never forgot that image as an image of kind of God's delight in us. That was 1994, but you can sense it's as real as if it was yesterday, really. And I've been hugely privileged with people like Mr. Miller and others since who've encouraged, who've taken time. And that's inspired me, really. The thing that Mr. and Mrs. Miller used to do was to read the newspaper with me and talk about the news. I read through Mark's Gospel with Mr. Miller. And just, again, people relating it to life, all of that, and being interested in me. I'm here today because of them and people like them.
all those people who influenced you when you were younger. Sorry, even. So how was the theology degree? Did you when you got to the end of that? Obviously, you did your dissertation.
Yeah.
Were you pleased that you'd gone down that route at the end of that?
I think I was just pleased I got to the end of it. The second essay I got back, the comments were, "You have an inability to express yourself in English," which I think would rate very poorly on a student satisfaction survey today. But there weren't such things. But as I was reeling from that kind of result, another lecturer said, "You okay?" And I explained what was what I'd just read, and they took me under their wing, and for the next few essays that I wrote, they'd work through the essays with me and critique. That person was the person who taught church history, which is why I decided to study with him and things. And again, I was kind of coached and helped through the course. And I think what all of those experiences have given me is a commitment to mentoring and helping others, and perhaps given me some of the experiences I didn't have when I was a younger person. So I didn't have the chance to be part of a youth group or to be with peers and helped to relate the good news of Jesus Christ to lifestyle and all of that, and to really earth it into the reality of everyday life and stuff.
Were you in the Christian Union at uni?
No. Because I didn't believe that God was objectively real, you see.
Yeah.
So I looked down on those people, including one person who was there at the time, who is now my wife, who, when we first met, and we were both training to be teachers, because this whole process of working through Cranmer's stuff took a few months. And about the first week, texted all of her friends and said, please could you pray for this guy? His name's Sam. He wants to be a vicar. And I don't think he really believes in God. She'd grown up at St. John's, Hertford, not too far away from here. So deeply rooted in the scriptures and did believe in God, for sure. So was outraged that this heretic looked like he was going to become a vicar. So prayed earnestly. She was very key in explaining the gospel to me, as it were, over a chocolate orange. There's a theme here, aren't there, of food, but yeah.
And then you got married shortly after, is that right?
Well, we both trained to be teachers and went to different parts of London. Claire went to East London, I went to South London, and we taught for 3 years. I was involved in a really lively church. The vicar there was a guy called Steve Wilcoxon, who was around here for a bit as director of parish development, I think. It was a great church. There were 12 couples, similar age to me. We all got married within 18 months of one another, not to each other, obviously, but and it was just, again, a great, and that's what I'd not had as a teenager, I think, and the Lord kind of blessed me at that stage of life with a great network. And we did lots of stuff together, including running a youth group, and doing summer residentials with CPS, the Church Pastoral Aid Society, so cramming teenagers into minibuses and going away for weeks at a time. And they were formative times, not just in terms of mentoring and teaching others, but also as you do that, you learn more yourself, don't you, than what you communicate. And the vicar would make me do an 8 o'clock Book of Common Prayer service and preach at that once a month, the first Sunday of the month. And I really cut my teeth on Bible teaching, I think, not just to young people, but also to adults in those years. And then went through the process of applying for ordination training. And in 2002, we got married, and then we moved to Nottingham and went to theological college. It was a random place to go for honeymoon, I have to say. But didn't work out quite so well. But went to theological college in St. John's, Nottingham.
And prior to that, you'd been teaching.
Yeah.
And how did the teaching job go? Because you were teaching history, weren't you?
Yeah. It was great in that I was around young people all of the time. In terms of their results, not brilliantly. That's not true, but there was one Monday morning, and it was about 10:30, and I was suddenly aware of a presence next to me, and it was the head teacher. And I realized at that point I'd been asleep. And he said, come and see me at break time. And I thought, this is P45 moment. So I knocked on the door. Kieran said, come in. And I went in. And he said, 2 things to say to you, Sam Corley. One is, you're the only teacher in this school whose lessons are so dull that even you fall asleep. Second is, you're the only teacher in this school who the kids respect so much that they carry on working, even when you're... And I said, I'm mortified. It will never happen again. I was leading youth work, basically late on a Sunday night. He was a Roman Catholic. He had been in a seminary until he met a Protestant lady who was now his wife. So he was really sympathetic, even if he believed himself to be of the one true faith and me to be a heretic. There's another theme here. And I said, it will never happen again. And he said, absolutely it won't, take this. And I thought, P45. And actually it was a revised timetable, and he'd taken me off teaching the first 2 lessons on a Monday morning.
Right,
So that he said, I appreciate what you're doing. There are a few people who could do it. I want to support and encourage you. This is a small thing I can do. What a great leader. Yeah.
So you weren't tempted to carry on with the teaching? You still...
When I left, one of the pupils who I'm still in touch with, and she's now a history teacher, wrote, I know you were only 1 page ahead of me in the textbook. If it was only that far. Yeah.
So then you went off to Nottingham, and what was your first job like? Because that was your first ordained job, wasn't it?
Yeah, so I went to Nottingham, and then after Nottingham moved to Lancaster for my curacy. And that was a church we kind of had known, because many of the kids who came on our cipher camps were from that church, St Thomas's Lancaster, which was great because all of the parents thought I was amazing. All of the kids knew the truth, as they always do. But that's where we started a family. It's where Nathaniel was born. But my wife had also, when we were in Nottingham, had been teaching in Mansfield in a tough school, and started a Christian union and brought some of those kids to our camps, which was interesting. But one of those ended up moving with us to Lancaster. So he was 16, we fostered him. So our family started kind of a young stage of life, really, with the 16-year-old, which made parents' evenings really interesting, because going to a parents' evening with a dog collar on, I was 26, my child was 16. We had great fun. Very proud of Danny. He's married, lives in Nottingham still, and just started training with St Mellitus, so he's going to be ordained as well. So really proud of him.
Fantastic.
Adrian, can I interrupt?
Yes, of course you can.
And when you're talking about Nottingham, can you tell the strange coincidence connecting you with the people at St Andrew's, Cheadle Hulme?
Oh yeah, no, I should, absolutely. So at Nottingham, I met Richard and Louise Young. You probably know Louise as Louise Johnson, daughter of Richard and Sylvia Johnson. So their daughter, Natalie, is my goddaughter. So I've actually stayed in Richard and Sylvia's old house, somewhere near here. I recognised the roads as I was driving around the other day. Sylvia terrifies me, because she's one of those people who you know just knows, and I always feel like I've been naughty around her for some reason. So when I said to Richard, I've got this job as Bishop of Stockport, he texted back saying, my mother-in-law is going to love this. But actually, Sylvia and Richard were at the service welcoming me at Stockport, and it was lovely to see them. So yeah, I've got a connection with here as well.
Fantastic. After Lancaster, what happened next?
So I did 3.5 really happy years in Lancaster. Lots of university students. We had a service at 9 o'clock on a Sunday night, which was brilliant until our first child arrived, and then was excruciating. But it was a really happy time. And I wondered about going to be an associate in a similar church to that, but I kind of didn't feel like much of a challenge. So I said to the bishop, please can I have a bog standard Anglican experience? Because I want to see if this works anywhere and everywhere. I've done city centre, student church. I just want to see, how does this work in a normal community, like the village where I grew up? There's no such thing as a bog standard Anglican experience, but he put me in the church just outside of Lancaster. Mainly farming community, village school, but quite a lot of people who chose to live there because it was near the university, but relatively cheap to live. So lots of international postdoc researchers and things. So that was great, because I found it really, 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 really hard. And it didn't work. And it was a great experience, actually, early in ministry. Yeah. Knocked some of the edges and corners off me, I think. And I had some great people around me on the PCC and the wardens who journeyed together. Some friends from the Curacy Church came out to join us. And gradually, we managed to grow and develop things. But from a place of weakness, knowing I knew nothing, I had nothing to offer. The only thing I did know was the one who could change and redeem all things. So it was a really humbling, difficult experience to have early on in ministry. But I'm very, very, very grateful for it.
That you did have it.
Yeah.
And then Bradford was next.
Yeah, so we kind of wondered about what next. This was around the time that Scargill House was relaunching. So my wife Claire and I travelled over to Scargill and had an idyllic weekend. It was beautiful June weather, so the skies were blue, the birds were wheeling above. But I just couldn't wait to get out. There was something about it that was, this is not the right place. And Claire was like, this is amazing, isn't it? Can you imagine the kids' bedroom there? And I was like, oh my goodness, how's this going to work? But as we drove away, I was quite quiet, and Claire said, I don't think this is right, is it? It would be idyllic, but I don't think it's right. And then about a week later, someone I'd met through involvement with helping people to discern whether they might be called to ordained ministry phoned and said, my husband's looking for a canon precentor. So if you imagine a cathedral, a precentor is the person with responsibility for the top half. So all of the music, the choir, all of that kind of stuff. And she said, we've interviewed loads of other people, can't find anyone. I think you'd be great. To which my response was, I can't read music and I can't sing a note, but if you offer me lunch, I'll come and eat your food. So a week after being in beautiful, idyllic countryside in Scargill in North Yorkshire, we were in inner city Bradford. And as we drove into Bradford, Claire said, Sam, I'll go anywhere, but this is like one extreme to the other. And as we drove into the cathedral, Claire's like, but this is it, isn't it? And I'm like, I think it is. I got no inner city experience, no interfaith experience, but one thing led to another, and we moved to Bradford.
And what was that job like?
So as well as being in the cathedral, I also had responsibility for the chaplaincy at the university. And if I'm honest, it was one of the most exciting and vibrant places to live. It was also one of the toughest and most challenging places to live, sometimes within the same day, within the same hour, really. To be in a city where faith was very much on the agenda and people were expecting to talk about belief. My wife Claire and I and the kids had some of the best conversations about God, and because God was real and you know, it was just part of people's life and culture. But the divisions, particularly between white communities that had been forgotten about, where many people were the third or fourth generation not to have employment, alongside a growing, pretty segregated Asian community, was quite tough. Yeah. And to be in the cathedral, so we had, on some occasions, we had the EDL rattling the gates at one end of the cathedral, and we had Unite Against Fascism rattling the gates at the other end of the cathedral. Obviously, Claire and the kids had gone off for the day, but it was quite interesting to be in that cross place, really, between these different worldviews. And
It's a real challenge.
Yeah.
Did you ever bring any of these people together in any way?
We tried, not those extremes, but we did. The cathedral had an honoured place in a way that was very precious, actually. People looked to the cathedral. They respected the bishop, the dean. And we were once in a meeting where someone slammed the table and said, and what does the church bring to this? And one of the leaders of the local council of mosques said, the table. There is nowhere else for us to meet and to have these discussions. And in my last few years there, I was privileged to be invited along by the bishop to kind of behind the scenes meeting where the university vice-chancellor, the secretariat of the council of mosques, the chief constable, the mayor, the leader of the council would gather and would talk about the real issues. And I've never been in such a place where there was really such mutual respect and trust, but really robust conversation. And the leader of the council of mosques would try out what he wanted to say before it went in press releases, and would say, I'm trying to bring my community along here. If I say this, they'll reject me. Help me find a way where I can communicate what needs to be said. But it was just wonderful, kind of. It really felt nitty-gritty, making a difference, transforming communities. The gospel at work.
And how long were you there in Bradford?
5 years.
5 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Quite a long stint.
Yeah. Yeah.
And where did you go next?
So after that, the new Diocese of Leeds had been created. So the previous Diocese of Wakefield, Ripon and Leeds and Bradford had been dissolved. And the new Diocese of Leeds had been created. And I was involved in the appointment process for the new diocesan bishop, who had been the Bishop of Bradford and then became the Bishop of Leeds. So, well, I won't say anything about my involvement in that, but I was pleased. But at the meetings with the various people involved in that, there was quite a bit of information about Leeds Minster, the kind of big parish church for Leeds, which had in the 19th century been a paradigm of how to do mission in a modern industrial city. So one of the great vicars of Leeds, Walter Farquhar Hook, had rebuilt the church in 4 years, and by the time he left after 22 years in the city, had started 27 schools, carved up the parish into 21 parishes, built 23 vicarages. And his motto was, for every poor child a school, for every poor man a pastor. So it had been amazing, but it had fallen on hard times, to the point where the Archbishop of Canterbury said, this church is a national scandal. And then about 5 minutes later, turned to me and said, that's the kind of church you should go to. Which I didn't know whether it was a compliment or a curse, really. But you know when people say things and it kind of sticks, and it was a bit like the driving through the gates of Bradford Cathedral. It's kind of like, I know what's going to happen here. And shortly after, the rector moved and there was a vacancy, and I ended up going to try and re-establish this church, which had a glorious, noble past, but had lost its way, really. It was the kind of place where people prided themselves in the past, but the heart of the place had gone out, and the connections with the city and everything had disappeared. So my role was to try and rebuild some of that stuff.
And how did you do that?
Through prayer.
Yeah.
So before I started, I got two ladies I trust, and one had been my theological college principal, into the church to pray. And my old theological college principal, who some of you who have been on General Synod will know, Christina Baxter, said, we really need to pray. And I said, yes, well, that's why I've invited you here. She said, well, I thought we were just going to pray, but we have to pray in a building like this. And she said, I'm going to the door because there'll be a skull. A church that's so dark, there must be death near the door. And about 3 minutes later, she said, found it! And there was. There was a skull right opposite the door. But above it was a funeral hatchment, kind of board that used to be hung outside of houses when people had died to commemorate things. And on it, the English translation of the Latin was, I will live again. So that was my prayer for that place, that it would live again. And it was dedicated to St. Peter. And I often think that dedications of churches are important, and I claim that really, the loosing and binding that Jesus talks about to Peter, and those words about the promise of life, and whether that would be through me or not. And I also had a strong sense of God saying, just plough the ground, which is a bit odd in the middle of a city, to use a farming metaphor, but I understood that. And I knew that most of the work that goes into producing crops is kind of what happens at this time of year, the ploughing the soil, the tilling, all of that kind of stuff. So manure and fertilizer. So I took that as my kind of model for what I needed to do there. It wasn't about growing it. It wasn't ready to bring people in. I didn't want to say, come and see what we're like, because it was awful. But about tilling the soil, adding nutrients, taking out the rocks and all of that. So.
And what happened as a result of that? Did you notice some changes? Did others notice some changes in the church?
So it was a place that felt quite dark. In fact, the other person who was interviewed at the time I was interviewed said, I couldn't have taken the job because I couldn't walk down the church because it just did something to me inside. I was like, it did that to me. That's why I liked it. So it's like fun. Something, when it's that clear what the issues are, it's great. So we did sort out some of the issues. And actually I learned a lot. What I came to realize was that actually it was about telling the truth. Most of the people there were afraid of death, actually, I think. Because for whatever reason they'd not heard or had forgotten the truth of the gospel, that there is no need to be afraid of death. And that whole sense of loss, which many of them were no longer in work, they were committed to organisations, many of which had lost their kind of power and influence, and were just struggling to find their place, their sense of self. Well, I know where you can find all of that. So just being honest with people. So there was Freemasonry around as well, which needed tackling. But I remember early on in a sermon saying, this is the most dysfunctional congregation that I've ever been part of. We are quite dysfunctional, aren't we? And I expected to get lynched, but as I said it, actually I could see people's shoulders kind of relaxing. And at the end of the service, the only comments I got were, that needed saying years ago. We've always known it. Thank you for saying it out loud. You're absolutely right. What do we do about it?
Yeah.
And I learned a huge amount actually about the truth will set you free. It's hard to hear, it's hard to say, but we've got to start with reality, because then the Lord can move us forward. And so we did a lot of truth-telling in that time, which wasn't easy. And I learned a huge amount. I'm very grateful to the folk there for their grace and their willingness to hear and to contend with it. Because they could have said, it could have ended up in a green ink letters to the bishop and me moving on or whatever else. But I think they realised that this was make or break for the church.
Was that your biggest challenge, really, in your career so far?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And it was I was only able to do that because of the lessons I'd learned in that first church where it was really hard. In Bradford, where the cathedral had gone bankrupt and the dean had rebuilt it from nothing. So it's kind of a theme of working things through. Yeah.
And from there to Bishop of Stockport.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the process, how you became Bishop of Stockport and what you knew about the process and what the process was?
Yeah, so there is a process where you kind of, like any ministry really, there's local discernment, so with the diocesan bishop, and then that goes through a national process. And then like any clergy role, you're interviewed. So Bishop Mark gathered together an appointment group to advise him, advisory group. So I was interviewed alongside others, and then one thing led to another, and I got the role. The more interesting thing, other than the nitty-gritty of the process, which involves the Prime Minister and the Queen and all kinds of things, and not being able to tell anyone, which is really quite awkward when your mother-in-law is living in the house with you and like, will you just tell me what's going on? Nothing's going on. Why do you say? Well, you're just very stressed and, what's going on? Well, nothing really. And particularly she lives in Northwich, so thinking, you're going to love this because we're coming near. This all comes off. But actually, the bishop thing's been around for a few years, and Stockport had always been the kind of place that represented what I was looking for. So the mix of rural and urban, of communities where there are lots of resources and some where there are not in the world's terms. Part of a team. So when Bishop Libby announced that she was going to Derby, I was like, you rat! This is too soon. And then it was announced that they wouldn't be appointing a new Bishop of Stockport until the new diocesan bishop had arrived. And I was like, oh. And then Bishop Mark was announced as the Bishop of Chester, and I know Bishop Mark quite well, and I was like, well, that would be too good to be true. That's never going to happen. But then there was just my prayer was, Lord, if this is not of you, just bring down an iron shutter right from the start. Let's not waste my time or anyone else's time and emotional energy on this. But there was just a sense of the Lord behind it all somehow. Yeah.
Had you always wanted to be a bishop, but did you always feel you were going to be a bishop?
No one is allowed to say out loud they want to be a bishop.
Oh, are they not?
But it's the kind of role, and there are other roles. I wasn't just interested in the purple shirt kind of thing. But I kind of knew that the kind of work and ministry of a bishop was one that made sense of my gift. So drawing alongside people, encouraging people, which any clergy person does, but particularly of other leaders. I really love drawing alongside clergy and lay leaders and working with them and encouraging and challenging and helping them to discern next steps and all that. I just love that, and I've done quite a bit of that. And the connections between church and civic, that was what I did quite a lot of in Bradford and Leeds, and just love it. Enjoying going into places, causing havoc, and then going into places and being a blessing, and opening the Word of God and all of that, and then the kind of style of ministry appeals as well. So it didn't have to be as a bishop, but that kind of a role was one that,
And what do you see the biggest challenges to be?
For me personally, or
in Stockport, for you? As Bishop of Stockport, not necessarily in Stockport.
So for me personally, the challenges of just holding so much information about different communities to be of any use, to try to get grounded and understand enough, which is about listening and learning, meeting people. But it's a big patch, so there's a lot to do, and I'm very aware of how little I know. In terms of the place, I'm aware of how there is huge wealth around here. I mean, I lived in Leeds, which wasn't far from Harrogate, so I know what it's like to have a bit of the south and the north, and, you know, in terms of wealth and everything else. But, man alive, there, you know, some of the places around here. And yet, there are also some places that are really struggling.
Yeah.
And the church kind of reflects that a bit as well. So the places where we have the least number of people attending church, have the least number of clergy and are in the poorest communities. And that just doesn't seem to be right. Yeah. I understand the reasons, but we need to sort that out. And that's across the whole of the diocese and many places as well. What does it mean to be doing mission and ministry together in a local area, so that local churches aren't by themselves, but together we're learning from one another and supporting one another as well? And that's not about the rich giving to the poor. It's also about the rich receiving from the poor as well. And there's quite a lot for us to do around that, I think. But there are some great people out there, both within our churches, but also within the local communities. And the current mayor of Stockport, Adrian Nottingham, has been really helpful in opening all kinds of doors. And yeah, it just feels like, for me, the right role, the right time, the right place with the right people. And I'm so grateful to God for the chance to be here, really.
And you've got a real passion for youth work as well.
Yeah.
How do you see that playing out?
Well, I go to lots of churches, and I'm the youngest. And I'm getting old. And I don't want to be the person that's turning out the lights. And that's not just because I want young people in churches for church's sake. It's not. It's because I want each young person to have repeated opportunities to hear and respond to the good news of Jesus Christ. It'd be really interesting to go around and just hear when you first made a decision to take seriously following Jesus. It may have been last week, but I bet it was kind of when you were in your teens or young adult stage of life. Or even if you came to a living later in life, there were kind of foundations laid at that point. And we need to be doing that for the generation around. And there's so much opportunity. Some people say, you know, kids don't understand anything of the scriptures or of church. Well, great. Clean sheet of paper. No baggage. Let's go for it and not see that as a negative.
Bishop Sam, thank you very much for coming to see us. It's now 7:20, so I'm going to have to end the first stage of our time with you. I think Christopher wants to say something. He's so subtle.
If it wasn't the COVID time, we would go and refill our cups and plates, but it's a little bit complicated. So if you don't mind, I could go and get you a glass of water. There's one over there. But if you could just give us a few minutes of some thought, and then so just hold on for a little bit more. We'll do it all in one, and then finish in a few minutes, if that's all right.
Great.
Okay.
I think that's a rhetorical question. Yes, is the answer. So, great. No, that's fine. Yeah,
I think that's my cue to leave.
Great. Adrian, thank you so much. He's very good at this, isn't he? I think he deserves a round of applause.
Hey, you're meant to be clapping, yeah?
What you won't know is that Adrian and I spent some time talking on Friday, and I'm really grateful for the way in which you've approached it, Adrian. Yeah, your kind of interest and care is much appreciated, so thank you ever so much for that. In the church I was in this morning, we were looking at some early verses from Mark's Gospel. So I'm not going to repeat what I said there word for word, but actually there's things there that I think I might just return to, if that's all right. So it was Jesus calling the first disciples. This is Mark chapter 1 from verse 16. As Jesus passed along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. As he went a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, who were in their boat mending their nets. And immediately he called them. And they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. I often think the start of Mark's Gospel is a bit like Mark breaking the speed limit. There's so much he wants to tell us to set the scene, and he does it at 100 miles an hour. So there's no birth narrative. We get all of the kind of Jesus being located in the story of the law and the prophets with a passage from the prophet Isaiah. We've had Jesus' baptism, we've had John the Baptist, and now by verse 14, we're well into things. And it's almost as if there's a 30 mile an hour speed limit, and Mark just eases his foot off the accelerator and slows down a bit, and we get the calling of these first disciples. And what Mark does here is almost to introduce 4 themes which the rest of the gospel explores. They could have occurred at the end of the gospel. Repent, believe, follow, fish. Which, if you want a definition of what Christian discipleship is all about, is probably well summarized by those 4 words. Repent, leave stuff behind, reorientate yourself, turn away, turn round. Believe, take hold of what's being offered to you. Here is life, here is truth, here is your future coming towards you. But it's not just about your head and your heart, it's also about your hands and your feet. So follow in the steps of Jesus. Be molded and shaped by him to be more like him. And also fish. Don't just follow Jesus, but work alongside him. Allow him to work through you in order to make earth a little bit more like heaven. So repent, believe, follow, and fish. Not just as they were called to be disciples, but things they were exploring every day for the rest of their lives. Just as for us. Things not just when we were called to be disciples, but things that we wrestle with every day of our lives. What does it mean for us today to repent? What does it mean for us today to believe? What does it mean for us today to follow? What does it mean for us today to fish? Repent, believe, follow, and fish. But what about Zebedee? Here are James and John, after years of being parented, all through the nappy stage, the spoon-feeding stage, the getting the naughty reports from school stage, wondering what they're going to do with their lives, will they marry the right person kind of stage. And now finally, they're taking up a bit of the slack when it comes to the nets. They're taking up the oars themselves, and Zebedee can take it a bit easier. The future is secure. The pension is right there. Until a carpenter comes along. Follow me. Oh, okay, there you go. And Zebedee is left in the boat. Great. Well, I want nothing else to do with this God. It's all fine and well and good for them. Look, going off, following this Jesus. Have a whale of a time while I try and catch the whales back into the oars and the nets. Thanks very much, Jesus. Could have been one way Zebedee responded. But I like to think he responded in a different way. That when he saw God at work in the lives of his children, he rejoiced. It's the same set of circumstances. He really is left holding the nets with the hired men, and he could have had every reason to be grumpy. And yet he rejoices. The work of God going on without him, and yet he chooses to rejoice. It's not a bad model for us whenever we're tempted to be grumpy because we're being left out or left holding the nets or the equivalent. To rejoice and to celebrate. I also like to think that he prayed for those boys, just as he'd probably done every day of their lives. Carried on praying for them wherever they were, whatever they were doing. Unimaginable costs that John and James had no idea about, and neither did Zebedee. And yet his way of supporting and encouraging them, even though they're not with him, even though they're absent, is to pray, just like Mr. Miller, Mrs. Miller, Mrs. Lynch. All those people prayed for me. Why am I here? Because of their prayers. Prayer changes life. And the great news is you can pray at any stage of life. And for some of you, that will be the most significant thing that you ever do. The kid that we fostered, when he graduated from Chester University, we came out of the cathedral and met his auntie. And she said, "I'm so pleased for everything that you've done for him. I didn't know what to do. So I did the only thing that I could do." And I said, "What was that?" And she said, "For every day of his life, I prayed for him." I said to her, "Auntie Olwyn, you are the reason he is here today." Prayer changes lives. It's how we involve ourselves in God's mission. It's how we change the world. Joy, celebration, prayer, and generosity. I don't mean parish share kind of generosity, though that is important. Let me be clear. But that kind of sense of being generous with resources. Because who supported James and John as they're following Jesus? It wasn't Jesus. We read elsewhere in the Gospels, it was women actually that provided for them. Revolutionary, countercultural. But for any of you who've got children, whatever age, you know that parenting is about having all of your money in a wallet replaced with a photo. That's what parenting is, isn't it? And it was true for Zebedee, I guess. Those who should have been earning money are now probably requiring money. And even if it wasn't money, something else. And he could have thrown his hands up in despair, or he could have responded with generosity. Sometimes I meet people for whom the Christian life seems to be one big sacrifice. And yet when I look at the ministry of Jesus, I don't see sacrifice really. What I see above all is generosity. It only becomes sacrifice when it collides with human sin. It's about generosity, called to a life of generosity. Repent, believe, follow, and fish. And as you do so with joy, do so with prayer, and do so with generosity. And pray that I might do likewise, please, as bishop. That I might be open to this work of repentance, of believing, of following, of fishing. I might know joy and be a person of prayer and a person of generosity, because we're in this together as sisters and brothers. God bless you.
Thank you, Bishop Sam. I think I'm back on there. Thank you so much for coming to see us today. We've really enjoyed, I know I speak for everyone when I say we were very much looking forward to you coming, and we've really enjoyed tonight. It's been fantastic. Thank you for sharing all the information you have with us about your life, about your ministry, and thank you for your closing piece as well. It's fantastic. So if we can just thank Bishop Sam in the usual way.
There is a plate if you would like to be generous towards the cost of this evening. But let's thank
to break.